Welcome back, folks. The state budget and its impact on education dominated the news this week. 5 superintendents of local school districts held a news conference asking the governor to veto the budget and allocate more money to education. Here to help us sort through those issues and the week's political news are Elizabeth DeGenis of the Sarasota Herald Tribune and Kate Bradshaw of Creative Loafing, both first-timers here on the show. Good morning to you, ladies.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for coming in. All right, so Elizabeth, I want to start with you. The superintendents sort of made a big show of how the new budget only allocates 47 cents per student, right? But the district's budget is more than $2 billion. So what are they talking about exactly there?
So the concern is that a lot of the money has to go towards enforcing this new school safety and security bill, and so much of that is going to go towards either getting additional school resource officers or possibly retired law enforcement, that the actual additional per student spending is only going to amount to 47 cents.
Okay, and so they're saying that that 47 cents is all that they have that's flexible, that they're able to. Okay.
Exactly.
And so the rest of the budget is, does the legislature hamstring the local school districts from what they can spend on which things?
Not exactly, but I think because so much money is going to go towards putting in place this new bill, it's kind of, there isn't as much flexibility for them.
Okay. What did you think about this?
Well, I think the fact that there's another bill that the governor signed that basically takes money and gives it to charter schools via scholarship programs and essentially encourages union busting, specifically teachers' unions. That says a lot about what the state legislature and governor think of public education.
I think it certainly says a lot about what they think about unions. In fact, I was just going to ask you, teachers hardly have any power really here in the state. I mean, not only do they not have a strong union, but the Florida Constitution actually forbids them from going on strike.
Right, and I mean, I think you look at what happens in places like West Virginia, where teachers do have the power to go on strike, and they can affect change that way. And I mean, teachers are so important. I mean, they're just fundamental to the basic, the basic functioning of society. We have to have an informed populace. Public education, I mean, the founding fathers knew that. And so it's interesting that they don't have more say in.
It certainly is, and that's we are in a right to work state, obviously, and that's part of the the drawback, I guess you would say, for people who are on that side of it, is that they're able to not having as much power as people in, say, West Virginia do.
Right.
For both of you now, I want to ask, how do you think Governor Scott signing this bill, do you think it will affect him negatively politically? Will he see any backlash?
Well, I think certainly advocates of public education and of workers' rights, certainly. And obviously, from the right, if we're talking about the school safety bill, as opposed to the budget, I mean, he's gotten criticism from the NRA, but I feel like that was a bit of a spat, and they're going to get back together pretty soon if he runs for Senate.
Yeah, and that's obviously a move that we're expecting. What did you think of that this week? Do you think Governor Scott will face any backlash? Obviously, we expect him to challenge Bill Nelson for his Senate seat in November.
I think this bill is interesting because it kind of spans both sides of the spectrum. I think you have these new gun regulations. You have to be 21 to buy a gun. You have the 3-day waiting period, so that kind of won't appeal to certain people. I think you also have this increased security in a chance of arming not exactly teachers, but people who could be teacher adjacent positions. So I think it's an interesting bill because there's kinds of there's things that both sides of people won't agree with.
Yeah.
Right. And I mean, that's what governance is, though. I mean, it's a huge compromise. I'm actually pretty shocked that they did something that the NRA doesn't like, because Florida, as we all know, has been this petri dish of gun laws in the past 20 years. So.
Yeah, there was a great article, I think, in the Atlantic. It was about Ms. Hammer, one of the most influential lobbyists, maybe the most powerful person outside of the legislature, many people think, in Tallahassee, and how she has influenced legislation there. Certainly been a lot of gun legislation, but very little of it limited gun ownership.
Yeah, I have a funny anecdote about that, actually. Mayor Rick Kreisman, St. Petersburg mayor, told me once when he was in the legislature and there would be a gun law on the floor, she would stand, she would sit like basically in the front row of the gallery and stare at lawmakers as they voted.
There was in that article, as well as stories that you just hear, that she kind of keeps a list about people who cross her. I mean, a lot of lobbyists do that, and that's our system.
Yeah.
It's the way that it works right now. I do want to get into what you just said earlier, though, about the NRA's relationship with Governor Scott. Obviously, they've contributed to campaigns for some of the Republican legislators in our state before. You don't think that him signing off on this bill will affect his relationship with the NRA if he does decide to run for that Senate seat?
Well, I mean, as somewhat of a cynic about Florida politics in general, I would say that I think it's theater. I think that he wouldn't be able to win a primary without them, without their support, just in terms of, their visible support and their financial support. He's got an A+ rating. I mean, this is probably just a ding.
Interesting.
Just going to say that.
I'm gonna toss that question to you when we get back from break, and we also want to dig a little bit more into that gun and school safety bill when we come back. Stay with us, folks. We'll be right back. Welcome back, folks. My two political guests this week, Elizabeth DeGinnis with the Sarasota Herald Tribune and Kate Bradshaw with Creative Loafing. Thank you so much for being here. Wanted to talk about the walkouts that we saw this week. I mean, obviously schools were the big story this week with the signing of the budget and the superintendents sort of protesting, but the kids have really made a big difference here, and they've sort of pushed, I think, the legislature to pass some bills that maybe, or particularly the gun and school safety bill, that we didn't think was really possible, certainly not with that kind of speed either. Tell me what you thought about the walkouts. Fairly significant.
Yeah, so I think it's fascinating to see what's kind of happened since, it's been a little more than a month since Parkland, and how these students have really taken over with activism, and really how activism has changed with social media too. So I think that on Wednesday we had nationwide more than 3,100 schools participated in these walkouts, which is just an amazing number. And students walked out at 10 a.m. for 17 minutes in honor of the victims of Parkland. So we saw that look different in different places. In Sarasota, which is where I primarily cover education, a lot of the protests were kind of helped by the administration, I'll say. They knew in advance that these were going to take place, and so they decided that the best course of action was to kind of plan for them, as opposed to telling students they couldn't participate. And that led to a lot of different iterations of a protest. Some were assemblies in gyms, some were walkouts. They actually did walk out of class and stand in a courtyard. So it was interesting to see.
And I've been struck by this because when I grew up, I graduated high school in 1997. Whoops. I didn't have that kind of fear about a school shooting. It wasn't as prevalent back then. I think that was the year before Columbine, actually. But these kids, they live with that fear. And it is interesting that they're sort of saying, look, we're going to change the conversation here because we're the ones who have to live in these schools and deal with this fear.
Right. We were just talking a few minutes ago about what school shooting happened when we were in high school. So you were in high school during Sandy Hook, or you had just graduated.
Just graduated, yeah.
I was a junior in high school when Columbine happened. Yeah, dating myself.
So but you're both younger than I am. Okay.
But it's still it's shocking that we can sit here and sort of age ourselves by what school shooting happened when. But I think these kids, though, there was a confluence of events in a lot of ways, I think. So not only was the legislature in session, but you just had these kids who decided, let's reach out. They asked organizers to help. I mean, they had help from adults in sort of organizing the movement. But I've had people in the, baby boomers tell me that this is reminiscent of the 60s and the
I've been hearing a lot of that recently, actually, that the vibe feels the same. Obviously, I didn't grow up then, but a lot of people have been saying that, with the main difference, of course, being how well these kids are organized on social media. Because as I someone put it really well this week, that they're digital natives. They've grown up in this era, so it's so second nature to them to organize that way to get everybody online. Right. I want to get to the gun and school safety bill, because obviously $400 million passed in the budget directly towards that, a number of different measures. I want to ask you both, we'll start with you, Elizabeth, what you think is most significant out of that, and what do you think is going to happen when we start to see that money that will go towards arming school staff, not necessarily teachers, but some of the school districts in this area have said they don't want to do that.
Yeah, so what's really interesting with this bill is it is kind of a local, it's up to local discretion. So it could really vary, at different districts how this ends up getting implemented. So some of the options are you can end up having more school resource officers, which are, deputies, sheriff's deputies, or police officers who are built in schools. They're full-time employees. Those are the most common That's what we see right now. You can have, as you mentioned, these kind of teacher adjacent positions who are armed and will have training, or you can have also retired law enforcement officers. So I think it'll be interesting to see. A lot of districts, like you said, have come out saying, we will not arm teachers. That's not going to happen. But some of them haven't. So it'll be interesting to see how that ends up playing out.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if a plague breaks out, we don't send in more plague. We were joking earlier about how when you remember lawn darts, those
the dangerous lawn darts?
The dangerous lawn darts. Those have been banned because they're not safe. People would get hurt. So by sending in more, by arming, and it is arming teachers, but it's just only if a teacher is a coach or, I don't know.
Not a full-time teacher.
Yeah, does Glee or something. But I think it's just kind of not really addressing the problem head on.
There are some people who say that, obviously, and that is an issue that we see. There is a lot of research that shows that if you have a gun in the home, that you're higher rates of suicide in the home, higher rates of homicide in the home. So, there is that danger. And we saw a couple school incidents this week where there were guns in classrooms.
Right.
But that remains to be seen how it's going to play out. One really quick thing. Before we run out of time, because we could do this all day.
Yeah.
Governor Scott, when do you think that we'll see him announce, and do you think we'll see him announce for that Senate seat? And Speaker Corcoran, I mean, he's expected to run for the governor's seat. Right.
So Governor Scott, I would wait on that one. I'd say sometime in the spring, definitely. I mean, it's time's wasting. So Richard Corcoran, I'm hearing just basically after session. So
yeah.
any day now. But I'm also hearing that he might run for Attorney General instead.
Interesting.
So another Tampa Bay lawmaker
as Attorney General,
running for Attorney General. There are lots of them.
Well, what I think is interesting, you asked before about how is Governor Scott going to be perceived after this bill, which for the NRA might not be seen as a positive thing. I think a lot of people have kind of been interested in how fast the state of Florida has acted after Parkland, whether you agree with what they've done or not. And I think in some ways that could be viewed as a positive. So I don't know how that will affect when he announces, but it could be a good thing.
Fascinating to see how it plays out. Counting on both of you to come back and talk to us about it a little bit later. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. We'll be right back, folks.